Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. I think that Climate Home News is split across two continents today. I'm in Barcelona. I'm Megan Rowling, the editor of Climate Home News. Joe Lowe, our news editor, is in London. Thais is in Argentina, and Sebastian is in Costa Rica. Where I'm sitting in Europe, it's pretty hot. We're having a heat wave. I think possibly Joe's suffering the most because he's in London. And I think a new record for a day in May was set this week with temperatures going up to 35 degrees Celsius there. Also, India is suffering a huge heat wave at the moment. I'll introduce everybody in a minute. I just wanted to set the scene, really, just off the back of this heat that we're experiencing. At Climate Home News, we got in some comments today from the UN Climate Change Executive Secretary, Simon Steele. I just wanted to read those out because they're a good scene setter for the discussion today. So Simon says, this climate-driven heat wave is double jeopardy at a time when the latest war in the Middle East is showing the soaring costs of depending on fossil fuel imports. But the solutions are just as clear: a faster shift to clean power, which is now cheaper than fossil fuels and faster to produce, and hence is mission critical for energy affordability and nations' economic security. He also says protecting human lives, businesses and economies from extreme heat and the many other soaring costs of climate change is core business for every nation, and it starts with kicking the fossil fuel addiction much faster. It also reinforces the need to invest more in building resilience to climate impacts, whether extreme heat, mega floods, wildfires or droughts that are also hitting food production and prices. Those comments to me seemed like a good place to start with our webinar today. And this is the context in which the UN climate policy process is unfolding in 2026. With the need for climate action now being more glaringly obvious than ever, but at the same time, against a difficult and complex geopolitical backdrop, with the US administration doing all it can to fragment multilateralism and extract, use and export more fossil fuels, and even pro-climate action governments now distracted by growing conflicts and pressure for more military spending, pushing them to cut aid budgets and climate finance. So just to recap where we were at the end of 2025, the European Union came out of COP30 feeling pretty disappointed and grumpy with the process and what it saw as weak support from some of its usual allies there. It was a pretty hard summit to report on for us, actually, because there were few major wins. There was a lot going on behind closed doors, and there was a big fail on getting consensus to launch work on a global roadmap to transition away from fossil fuels in energy systems under the UN climate process. With that in mind, the COP30 presidency tried to save the day at the last minute by promising to come up with two voluntary roadmaps on transitioning away from fossil fuels, or TAF as it's sometimes known, and halting deforestation. And we should have those roadmaps by COP31 in Antalya in Turkey in November. There was a lot of rancor as well around late changes to the adaptation indicators for the global goal on adaptation, which we're going to talk about later, although developing countries did get a promise to triple adaptation finance by 2035, albeit with no baseline, so we don't know exactly to how much. The biggest win, which was hailed by civil society, was perhaps an agreement to set up a new just transition mechanism that will support countries, communities and workers in ensuring that the shift away from fossil fuels and the adoption of clean energy, including renewables, doesn't damage their economies and their livelihoods, harm human rights, and ideally will share the benefits more fairly. How to set up and operationalize that mechanism is going to be discussed in Bonn, and there is a draft decision due on that, which will then be forwarded to COP31 for approval if all goes according to plan. So before we go into more details about what to expect from the June climate negotiations, we're going to talk first about the takeaways from the Santa Marta summit in Colombia. This was seen as an important way of moving beyond the blockages in the UN climate process, and it built a coalition of around 60 countries that want to tackle a shift away from fossil fuels. So we're going to start with that, check in on a few other key topics that have emerged in the run-up to Bonn, and then we're going to throw ahead to the mid-year talks taking place in Germany from June the 8th to the 18th. However, before we actually start with that, I just wanted to to say that this webinar is something we want to do more of. It's different from our usual webinars where we invite experts to come and talk to our readers. This time we wanted to bring you closer to the journalists who are doing the reporting at Climate Home News. It's a bit of an experiment in building a different kind of relationship with the people who follow Climate Home News. And for the first time, we've made it available only to subscribers, including essential free subscribers who get access to some of our content. And to everyone who's already a paid subscriber, we'd like to say thanks very much. It means a lot to us. We also invited paid subscribers to invite questions ahead of today, and we'll get to those later in the Q&A part of the webinar. But anyone who's attending today can also add questions and comments in the chat, and we'll try and answer as many of those as we can, either as we go along or in the last part of the webinar. So to introduce you to our journalists, we have Sebastian Rodriguez, who first joined Climate Home News as investigations and special projects editor, and he's currently a contributing freelance reporter based in San Jose in Costa Rica. Sebastian attended the conference in Santa Marta, reported from there, and he also leads on nature and forest coverage for Climate Home News. And we have Joe Lowe, who's been news editor at Climate Home News since 2023. He joined as a reporter in 2020 after stints writing about container shipping. That's why his coverage of the International Maritime Organization is so good. And also politics in the UK. Joe is going to be covering the Bonn talks during the second week. And then we're lucky to have Thais Gadea Lara, who's a climate reporter from Argentina and has been covering the climate negotiations since 2014 and will be known to a lot of people on this webinar. She also leads workshops on climate communication, coordinates a climate book club, which sounds really interesting, and collaborates with different media outlets. So Thais is going to be at Bonn throughout, and she's going to be reporting for Climate Home News as well as a contributing climate journalist. So now I've introduced everyone, let's get stuck into to the different topics we want to cover today. So I'm going to start with Sebastian, because Sebastian was at the Santa Marta conference, and that was seen as one of the key follow-ups from COP30 and one of the main moments in the climate diplomacy schedule for the first half of this year. Sebastian, can you start by telling us why did the Santa Marta conference actually happen, and what was the aim of that meeting?
Sure, and thanks for the introduction as well. Yes, we were there in Santa Marta almost as a direct result of what you mentioned happened at COP30, where a group of countries in Belém, at that time over 80 countries, pushed for the development of a global roadmap away from fossil fuels, which did not end up materializing as part of the COP process, and it ended up instead as this voluntary initiative that the Brazilian government is currently developing. And it emerged out of the frustration of those negotiations, and we were there in Belém when countries were debating this, and that was visible when they were first presenting this push for a global roadmap away from fossil fuels. As part of that effort, they also identified the need for a dedicated space just to discuss the transition away from fossil fuels. And that developed surprisingly quickly. In about 5 months, it was an initiative led by the Netherlands and Colombia, and hosted in Santa Marta, which is a Caribbean city in Colombia. And it emerged surprisingly quickly, as many of the delegates in Santa Marta were saying. It was precisely that. It was a space where countries could debate not whether they wanted to transition away from fossil fuels or not, but how that transition was going to happen. It was meant to be a conference with a lot more participation and a kind of different methodologies to what you would see at a COP. Right. One of those was, for example, the participation of sectors, of civil society, private sector, representatives from indigenous communities and Afro-descendant communities. So it was an effort to make this discussion both deeper and more participative than it had been at COPs.
Absolutely, it did seem to be that way. We saw lots of photos of people crammed into rooms for various groups, and in the run-up to the conference, which was the first global conference on transitioning away from fossil fuels, right? And then those sort of consultative processes, whether they were academics or indigenous groups, and this People's Assembly, which brought everybody together, was then sort of fed into the more formal conference, right? So would you say, you know, as someone who was there throughout, that it was a success? What were the key takeaways, and did it feel like it had actually really kick-started discussions on how to transition away from coal, oil and gas, whereas, you know, within the UN climate process, that has become a bit of a sort of toxic subject?
Yeah, it's difficult to say if it was a success or not. I think that would be probably judged with time, because what it did achieve, that was one of the aims of the chairs of the conference, was start a sort of different process that can complement COPs. And they were suggesting this not being necessarily a negotiation process, but rather a space for dialogue between countries and sectors, and that you could argue it did deliver that process, because at the conference we also heard that the announcement of a second conference that's happening next year in Tuvalu. And that will carry on the same discussions that were started here in Santa Marta. A lot of them, you know, there is a sort of a summary report of the conference, but it was never meant to deliver kind of a first agreement or a declaration. It's not a negotiated document, so right. I would take it with caution, but it does include sort of the discussions that happen in Santa Marta, and a lot of them are quite technical. And I think that's what many of the delegates at the conference were referring to when they said they didn't really have a space to discuss this at COP. So it includes things like developing national roadmaps away from fossil fuels, and it includes debates on debt and reforming international finance to enable the conditions for the transition. And there were certainly certain omissions in this final report, which one of them being the discussion on health, for example, which some observers kind of were critical of, not having a more a bigger role in this report. But in not being a negotiated outcome, this is basically the conference filtered through the chairs of the conference. It certainly had a different mood, and we can probably discuss a bit more about that later, but certainly it had a different spirit than what we felt at the previous maybe 2 or 3 COPs. This was definitely a more uplifting conference for delegates.
Right. And there were about 60 countries there, quite a few European countries, African countries, Latin American countries, a few big oil producing nations as well, right? Including, I think, Canada, and there's Norway there too, right? It's interesting, isn't it, that, you know, finally there is a feeling that for those countries that actually do want to move forward with the fossil fuel transition, that there will be a process that can actually help them and support them. So I think there was also a launch of a scientific panel there that can provide advice to countries that want to put together their own national roadmap. And I think France was the first country that came out with such a roadmap during the high-level segment of the conference that has deadlines for when it's going to phase out different fossil fuels, which was obviously, you know, an attempt to set an example. But one thing we know from the discussions is that, as you said, it's going to be very complicated, very difficult, and all sorts of things need to be tackled in order to help this happen, such as how do you replace revenues from fossil fuels that fund large parts of countries' budgets? How do you do that unless you tackle debt at the same time? A lot of global South countries have really high levels of debt. And also, you know, how does trade fit into the picture as well, right? There were discussions around difficult things like clauses in international trade agreements that allow companies to sue governments if they are seen to be damaging their investments in fossil fuels, for example. Now, I just wanted to go on to talk a little bit about how does this all fit together with the other roadmap process that I mentioned in the introduction, which was launched by the COP30 president right at the end of Belém, when we couldn't get an agreement there on a UN backed process as such. André Correia Lago decided that he was going to voluntarily consult with countries and put together a voluntary roadmap, which, you know, is being worked on as we speak. But is not part of the formal UN climate process. So how does the Santa Marta conference fit in with that, Sebastian? And where have we got to with the work on this other global roadmap?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think what you mentioned on the coalition of countries is very important for this. And it definitely felt like part of the effort in arranging this conference was bringing all these governments together. Among them, as you mentioned, some oil and gas producing countries from both the global north and south. So yes, Norway was there and Canada, but there was also Nigeria and Brazil discussing how to transition their industries away from fossil fuels and kind of the enabling conditions that they required. And so it did feel that forming this self-described coalition of the willing was a big effort in as part of the conference. And it's perhaps one of the things that would need to be assessed in the next conference, how that coalition ends up forming or ends up becoming a more formal, perhaps a negotiating bloc, who knows, but a more cohesive group of countries, which in this first approach was not necessarily as defined within a single group necessarily, and that is precisely one of the things that I would be looking out for, how these countries interact in as part of the now formal negotiations. Some delegates and ministers at the Santa Marta conference suggested the possibility of presenting an agenda item at the Bonn conference that would include perhaps discussing the same initiative that was discarded at COP30 in Brazil for a global roadmap away from fossil fuels. That not necessarily needs to be adopted right away, but it was certainly floated as a possibility of how to keep this discussion alive as part of also the formal process. It's important to remember that Santa Marta was not part of a UN formal process. It did not lead to a negotiated outcome, and so whatever happens, and the idea is for the discussions that happen in Santa Marta to kind of fuel momentum into the UN process. So several delegates in Santa Marta were also a bit perhaps concerned on how to keep that discussion alive as part of the formal process as well. So that would be something to look out for.
Yes, definitely. I mean, it will be extremely interesting to see how that coalition or members of that coalition try and land, the outcomes from Santa Marta in the UN climate process, as well as this parallel process of the voluntary roadmap being put together by the COP30 presidency. So we checked this morning, in case there were any submitted amendments to the provisional agenda for the Bonn climate talks, which in the past has been a signal that there's going to be some kind of a row over the agenda at the start of the Bonn climate talks, which last year actually delayed the official opening of the Bonn climate talks for like a full day, or even slightly more than a full day. And so far we haven't spotted anything on the UN climate change portal where these submissions have to be formally made, but who knows within the next 2 weeks whether we will actually see a country or group of countries try and submit something in order to get this onto the agenda and get it kind of back into the formal process. So that's one thing that we'll certainly be keeping an eye on. Also on the COP30 transitioning away from fossil fuels roadmap, there's going to be an event during the Bonn climate talks, I think sometime around the middle, where the COP30 presidency is going to present where it's got to with its consultations, and yeah, obviously try and formulate some kind of sort of draft proposals, and we'll hear more about where that roadmap process has got to during Bonn. So we're really looking forward to that. We know that countries have made submissions, a range of submissions about what should be in the roadmap and how that should then incorporate issues such as justice and help for global south countries, which is something the UK has promoted. The EU has been asking for quite definite timelines on phasing out fossil fuels. Russia said as part of its submission that it definitely doesn't want this to be part of the formal UN climate process, which, you know, is resurfacing some of the arguments that we saw in COP30. The Turkish COP31 presidency warned against fragmentation in his speech at the Copenhagen Climate Ministerial last week, saying that, you know, national roadmaps are very important, but implying that those should be part of the nationally determined contributions, and that you know, there should be a cohesive process, which is what we do not have at the moment. At the moment, the outlook is for the world to be drowning in roadmaps, and not just fossil fuel roadmaps. And we'll talk about some of the others in a bit. But it does appear that, you know, in the coming, I wouldn't like to say how long, there would need to be an effort somehow to bring all of these discussions together, but at the very least the discussions have started. So we will finish for now talking about the fossil fuel transition roadmaps, and before we open up the discussion to other topics that are going to be discussed and negotiated at Bonn, we also wanted to focus in on something that may be a bit less controversial than transitioning away from fossil fuels, but it's potentially pretty effective in helping to bring about that shift away from coal, oil and gas in energy systems, and that is electrification. So this was brought up by the International Renewable Energy Agency at its assembly in January in Abu Dhabi. I was there, and the Director General mentioned that this was something that is important for the agency, and that was potentially going to try and work towards an electrification target within the UN climate process. And we've seen some momentum starting to build on this, especially at the Copenhagen Climate Ministerial last week. So Joe covered what was said on that at the Copenhagen meeting. So Joe, can you explain to us how those discussions are kind of shaping up around electrification and how it could potentially land at COP31?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's something the COP31 president of negotiations, Chris Bowen, the Australian, he's been talking about it for a while, not about the goals specifically, but about the importance of electrification. And at Copenhagen, the COP31 president, as opposed to president of negotiations, the Turkish climate minister, Murat Kurum, said, you know, we need to increase electrification as fast as possible. And separately, ARENA have come up with this target of 35% of final energy consumption by 2035. 35 by 35 is the snappy title for that goal. So the COP presidents haven't said this is a goal we want yet, but they have talked up the importance of electrification a lot. I suspect they probably are going to try and push for this goal to be agreed at COP31. I doubt very much they'll try and agree in Bonn. I think they'll be kind of gathering support for it there. It could either be a negotiated outcome, so everyone gets together and in the agreement they say we want this goal of 35% by 2035, in which case they're all kind of, at least in theory, committed to it. That's what happened with tripling renewables goal we saw before, and other goals. But sometimes when there's a bit less support for a goal, they just have it as a coalition of countries. So I think nuclear there was a pledge on that at one of the recent COPs. Also biofuels, more controversial technologies. And with those, they just had a coalition of countries saying, we'll do this. And not having to get it agreed by everybody.
Yeah, exactly. It's difficult to know in advance how these things will land. I mean, obviously, the strongest outcome is for it to be included in a negotiated text that comes out of the COP, like we saw with the in Dubai, when we had the outcomes of the first global stock take, and that included the transition away from fossil fuels in energy systems, the tripling renewables goal that you mentioned by 2030, and I think it was doubling the rate of energy efficiency. And perhaps electrification is something that wasn't so in focus at the time, but as in the intervening years, economies are shifting more towards electrification, and obviously that electricity needs to be clean energy if it's going to help us to keep to the Paris Agreement temperature goals. But certainly without more electrification, we're not going to get off fossil fuels anytime soon. So that is really something that we're going to be watching throughout the rest of the year, and because it's something that emerged in the first few months of this year, we definitely thought we wanted to keep that front of mind, even though, as Joe said, it's not going to be so much on the agenda at Bonn. Going back to the Copenhagen Climate Ministerial, the Turkish COP31 President designate also said that Turkey is going to be looking at the practical steps needed to scale up climate finance in the run-up to the summit there, specifically for the developing world. How to do that, working with all actors, including the private sector, to advance something called the Global Implementation Accelerator, which was announced at COP30, but quite frankly, we don't really know what it is at this point, but we just know that it's supposed to speed up climate action, including the NDCs, and I guess that also includes climate finance, but also the recommendations that were in the Baku to Belém roadmap, which we'll be speaking about very shortly. Turkey said donors will be held accountable for the commitments they made under the $300 billion finance goal agreed in Baku. That was to deliver $300 billion, mobilized public finance and private finance, mobilized by public money by 2035, and also other things that are on the COP31 presidency radar, tripling funding from the UN climate funds by 2030, which was something that was agreed at Baku, COP29, and there's also going to be a replenishment of the Green Climate Fund, which is on its radar. The UK has just cut its contribution, the pledge that it made to the Green Climate Fund. So what we know is that none of this is going to be easy, especially when it comes to getting ideas off paper and into practice when they're not actually in negotiated texts. So the Baku to Belém roadmap is a process that is supposed to help get climate finance overall to 1.3 trillion a year by 2035, and the $300 billion supposedly coming from wealthy governments is part of that 1.3 trillion a year. Now, Thais has covered this Baku to Belém roadmap, which was announced actually last year before COP30. Thais, why is it important? I mean, I'm not sure this was the first roadmap, but it certainly was one of the things that got roadmaps onto the diplomatic agenda. What's happened since it came out, and what's the potential there? What does it tell us about what might happen with other roadmaps on other topics?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's funny every time I hear, like, especially when during Belém, they start with this, well, let's work on a roadmap to transition away from fossil fuels. And I was like, sometimes even the only one or a few one asking, like, okay, but what is happening like with the roadmap on finance? Because that could be like the first model. And in short, I would say that, like, we need to be careful when covering or even like following these proposals that sounds like really good in theory, and like they are going to solve everything on the topics, but in practice they can be more complex or even confusing. And during all this year that in Climate Home News we have been covering what happened with the Baku to Belém roadmap, I would say that maybe like just to structure like three key questions that we can ask when following these other roadmaps that now they want to create. The first one will be how and why do these roadmaps appear? Like the Baku to Belém roadmap emerged with the decision of the NCQG, the new climate financial goal, to try to see how to scale up finance from the $300 billion to the 1.3 trillion. And Brazil and Colombia, I don't know if anyone here remember, but they were among the countries defending it in a way to try to help compensate that figure that it was not what especially developing countries were hoping for. So it starts as an idea with a lot of expectation around, especially from developing countries and civil society representatives. The second question will be, what will these roadmaps be? Because in Baku and after Baku, every time we try to ask the presidencies, okay, but what this roadmap is going like to be, like it's, as you mentioned, it's going to be a process. It's going to be only a document. It's going like to be now, I don't know, like a workshop, a 2 years work program. And there was no clear answers. It was like, we are going to develop, we are going to work on that. And even our coverage last year in Bonn, I was bothering everyone, like trying to ask, okay, how the work on the Baku to Belém roadmap is going. And head of delegation of some countries, they were like, we do not understand what the presidencies, the Azerbaijan and Brazilian presidency, are doing. And both delegates from countries, from governments, and also civil society representatives, they were not really happy with the transparency and the clarity of all the process, of how the meetings were going, of which voices were going like to be then taken into account on the final outcome, whatever that final outcome could be. So the process is also important, like try to understand like why the deforestation and fossil fuels roadmap appear, what they could like resolve at the end or help develop at the end. But the question about like the definition, what is going like to be, is also important. And the third one, that maybe is the one that we can have like the most learnings, I will say, or try to see some of the learnings from this Baku to Belém roadmap, is what did that roadmap end up being? Because of all this lack of transparency and clarity during the process, I could feel, and we could all feel, that from countries, especially developing ones, and civil society representatives, there start to be like a reduction of expectations of that. And even that is why during Belém, we didn't hear too much about the discussions on the roadmap, because they decided to put the focus on other items of the agenda of the negotiations in order to request for finance, not on the roadmap. Because they start expecting like, okay, this is not going like to be anything ambitious, not what we thought or we were told in Baku that was going like to be. So the roadmap was a report. Basically, it was a document prepared by the presidencies of Azerbaijan and Brazil that when you read it, it's easily like to go through. You can see a lot of like wonderful recommendations of how we can scale up finance, how we can increase climate finance, but nothing concrete in terms of like implementation and in terms of commitments. Like it has a lot of description, a lot of recommendations, but it's weak in terms of commitments. It has a lot of focus of what can be done outside the convention process, and especially with other actors, like for example, multilateral banks, but not as much focus as public finance and the responsibility of countries. That was what the NCQG was supposed or is supposed to be in practice. So there were a lot of mixed feelings with this report that was present in Berlin, but even like the COP30 president told us when they present the report that for him, like the work was done by the presidency, that they just hear the parties, they saw the submissions, they had these consultations during the whole year, and they delivered the report, and that was their commitment or the goal.
Right.
Can we say this roadmap ended or dead? Not
Is
yet.
it still alive?
Yeah, is it still alive? Well, I think they want to continue. In fact, now in Bonn, they are going to be two different events. One, it's going to be open. The other, it's going to be closed. And the idea will be to try to do a follow-up and work on the implementation of that roadmap.
Right.
And I would say it will be interesting to see in these events really how this is going to be implemented, especially consider that even when it's the roadmap, it's part of the NCQG decision, there's nothing concrete yet on how those recommendations that appear on the report are going to be included in the decision. So I would say it could be a good or bad example on how the other roadmaps could be at the end.
Right, exactly. Once you've got the document, you then need to put it into practice, like we were saying. There are going to be some discussions, I think, at Bonn under something called I'm probably going to mispronounce it, the Veredas dialogue, which I think is about shifting broader global flows of finance towards the aims of the Paris Agreement. Do you know what's going to be discussed during that dialogue? And can you just give us a little bit of information about that?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, it's going to be this dialogue that is on Article 2.1 C of the Paris Agreement, that the goal is to make financial flows consistent with the low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. The goal of this dialogue, that it's going to take place on Tuesday 9 and Wednesday 10, is for the parties and other actors to share the best practice, challenges, opportunities to how to accelerate the implementation. It's going to be interesting to see because there's always this discussion about this article and the article, the sub-article 9 about the responsibility of countries to mobilize public finance. And this is always the fight between developed and developing countries. It's always there, especially in Bonn. So it will be interesting. In fact, EU made a submission on their suggestions or what they want to see in this dialogue. And they specify this should be a dialogue with all the voices there, but non-prescriptive. We are not going to change the financial commitments of the agreement. And they want to hear and identify the parties' priorities. So it will be interesting. And the other one that I would say, the other topic interesting to follow at Bonn will be the discussions, the implementation of the NCQG. Because in the Mutirao decision, parties decided to establish a 2-year work program to continue the discussions on the implementation. And we have to remember that this is the first year of the NCQG, so it should be already started to be implemented. So, and spoiler, finance on climate is not going really well during the last year, and especially not in the 2 last year context. So finance is always a key issue, like by itself, but also because it appears in other items of the agenda. So it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. The backdrop, as you say, is not great, although the figures out from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development showed that countries had managed to deliver more than 100 billion a year that they'd promised to start delivering back in 2020, but didn't actually deliver until 2022. But in 2023 and 2024, they did deliver more than 130 billion each year. But since then, we've seen the US back off from climate finance and donors start to cut their aid budgets and climate finance. So it really isn't going to be very obvious how, as you say, in this first year of the new climate finance goal, they're going to start scaling up. So yeah, we'll definitely be keeping an eye on that. There are some other dialogues happening that we'll come back to shortly. We're just aware that time's ticking by. There's way too much to discuss. We definitely want to talk a little bit about adaptation, right? Because there was quite a nasty session at the end of COP30 in Belém, a lot of sniping about a last-minute agreement to cut down the number of indicators for the global goal on adaptation. And the answer by the COP30 presidency was that, this could be taken up again in Bonn. We didn't really know how at the time. I don't know if any more clarity's emerged on that since. But could you just set the scene on that, Thais? And do you think it's going to end up being, more heated discussions on these adaptation indicators, or will there be a way to move things on?
I would say it could be. We always have to remember how the previous formal meeting ended, because you're going to see a little, at least, of that tension in the next meeting, that the next formal meeting is going to be the conference in Bonn. As we could spoken with different observers and even delegates, there have been, like in the informal calls and meetings that they have since Belém, the countries, especially Latin American countries, and even other countries like Sierra Leone, were the ones that they were not satisfied, and even they objected during the plenary because of the adaptation indicators, that they were saying this, that they were not happy, and especially because the indicators that they were decided didn't respect all the work that all the countries have been doing during the previous years. That said, can we see these discussions and these tensions like to be again, I don't know, in the agenda discussion or even blocking? It could be. That's always a possibility. Probably we are going like to here again, because as Bonn is like the open space and the formal one, probably they want to make that publicly. But some were suggesting that probably what they, as now it's going to start like a 2-year program on how to implement this indicator. Probably on those discussions is when some countries could try to, let's say, improve the indicators that they were not happy to. So it's tricky. But I would say what it's important is how disappointed some countries left. But there were a lot. It was not only Latin America, even EU, they were not happy with the indicators. So it's something that definitely it's going to be there. Adaptation, it's important for the Pacific Islands also. So Australia should also like be putting that agenda on the table. But yeah, on that, we cannot say yes or not. It could be, but definitely it's something that it's going like to be around.
Yeah, at least I guess the list kind of got gabbled through, but yeah, not everybody was happy about it at all. And, it's been 10 years since the Paris Agreement enshrined the global goal on adaptation, and only, a decade later is there a list of ways to measure progress on adaptation. Meanwhile, extreme weather events are hitting around the world. And so the pace is pretty glacial on adaptation. Right, so there are other dialogues that are happening at Bonn, as I mentioned. I won't go into them all. There's an important one coming off the back of the first global stocktake in Dubai, but that dialogue took 2 years to get started. That is, I think, the first time there will be discussions on the outcome of the global stocktake under a dialogue that's going to be happening in Bonn. There will also be a Sharm el-Sheikh joint workshop, as it's known, which will basically look at the progress, challenges and opportunities on identifying needs and accessing means of implementation for climate action in agriculture and food security. And that is probably going to be a lot of sharing of best practices and laying out of needs and talking about technologies that will help countries cut emissions from agriculture and adapt their agriculture. But I don't know to what extent that's going to go into how to fund those. Certainly, I think the climate funds under the UN process are involved in that discussion. There are 2 other dialogues happening as well. One is on trade, which is pretty cool because that was one of the positive things that came out of COP30, an agreement to set up a dialogue on trade and climate change under the UN climate process. And also there was a forum launched to discuss trade and climate change, which was floated by Brazil before the COP30 summit and then was formalized in Belém. And it's still pretty early days for this, but Joe's been covering that since last year. So what do we know about what's happening with that so far, Joe? Maybe not a lot, as it's only just getting off the ground, but tell us what you know.
Yeah, sure. So these 2 events, one's on a Saturday in Bonn, one's on the Sunday. The trade dialogue is part of the UNFCCC process. The Integrated Forum on Climate Change and Trade is not. So it's kind of a strange situation where you probably have the same people having the same conversation 2 days in a row. Yeah, one of them is going to be the Integrated Forum on Climate Change and Trade is likely to be a bit more of a free-flowing Santa Marta style informal exchange of views under Chatham House rules. So nothing leaving the room and everyone able to talk a bit more freely and openly and hopefully engage with each other on because the issue is a very controversial issues and there's issues of, it's all about what's fair really. So what's fair depends who you ask, and everyone has pretty strong views on it, on things like the carbon border adjustment mechanism of the EU. Some people say it's protectionism that's going to stop the developing countries developing, wrapped up in green clothes. The Europeans would say that it's stopping, blocks with less stringent climate regulation stealing their companies, basically. So pretty strong arguments on both sides. So yeah, with the Integrated Forum, we know a bit more about what it's going to come up with. It's going to decide on its roadmap for the year and on 2 priority areas of focus. It's going to be an informal stakeholder roundtable. So I expect trade unions, maybe businesses, experts, people like that. And they're going to announce an independent expert panel. So it'll be interesting to see who's on that and what they come up with. Yes, we don't know a huge amount, but it should be quite interesting to follow.
Yeah, very interesting. And I wonder if it will take some of the heat out of the just transition and response measures negotiations, where the CBAM, the European carbon border adjustment mechanism, was often rearing its ugly head and causing some problems. But I mean, logistically speaking, practically speaking, I think there are quite a lot of issues with how it's being implemented and, based on what data. And I was at an event recently where Turkey spoke pretty eloquently about how, the system isn't really ready in the sense that it doesn't award those companies that actually are putting green energy and ways of production into practice. So yeah, a lot going to be going on there, but I think it was definitely overdue that these discussions on trade taking place. Another dialogue that's happening, I think, in the first week, Thais, is on oceans. I think this is the 5th dialogue on oceans and climate change, which happens every year at these intersessionals in Bonn. And we know it's a priority for the COP31 presidency. They said they'd place a focus on it because there's a lot of people living along the world's coasts. And, you know, we really, really rely on oceans to prevent the climate from overheating, or more than it already is. But it's also a source of food, livelihoods, security, you know, covers 70% of the planet, and yet it doesn't really have a formal place in the UN climate talks, which, you know, seems like a bit of an oversight. Do we know what's going to be discussed this year?
Yeah, there was already like some document by the presidency considering the informal virtual consultations that they had in March, and the dialogues were going to be on Wednesday and Thursday of the first week in Bonn. They're going like to be the first day, it's going like to be interventions by different countries and other actors like civil society representative, and the second day it's going like to be breakout sessions. And what I think is more important is that the topics that these interventions should be about are first ocean-based priorities in the NDC, that this could be something interesting regarding what you mentioned, that, yeah, this is an important topic, but it's not formally in the process. So it will be interesting, this discussion, how they go. Of course, means of implementation, let's say finance, that this is something very important, especially for small island countries and the most vulnerable regions. And the third one, it's like the synergy between ocean, climate, and biodiversity. So these are supposed to be like the three topics that the work on this dialogue should be about. Another thing that is interesting is that so far the suggestions from some countries of what to do with the results of the dialogue is still diverse. Some say it's like to put more the focus on the global climate action agenda, that is the work with other actors, complementing the Paris Agreement. Another one say to inform the convention and other process like outside the COP. And the third one, my favorite, to develop a roadmap on ocean. So again, we should maybe consider the questions that we asked at the beginning.
Right, absolutely, as if we needed any more roadmaps. We were actually going to talk about the forest roadmap as well, which is being prepared by the COP30 presidency as an outcome of COP30, but not a formal outcome, a voluntary roadmap, in the same vein as the transitioning away from fossil fuels roadmap, which Sebastian has been following. Sebastian, is it actually going to be discussed at Bonn? Is it on the agenda, or is this something that was more fleshed out at the UN Forum on Forests and is just kind of existing in its own bubble until we get to COP31? If you could just give us a very quick update on that.
Yeah, no, the roadmap itself is not in the agenda in Bonn. It will be there will likely be some informal consultations happening, as the Brazilians presented it during the Forum on Forests. They are proposing and suggesting countries to submit their own plans to end deforestation, and so this was born from a series of consultations and hundreds of inputs from countries, and now it's undergoing a second sort of engagement process that will result in the drafting of the first version of this roadmap during the summer, probably towards August, according to the calendar presented by the Brazilian government, and then launched likely towards September.
Okay, so probably more on that later in the year. Just wanted to, as we don't have a lot of time left, I just wanted to have a look at a couple of questions that we've had. One from Richard Klein. Hi, Richard. Thanks for the question. Yes, I think we covered probably some of Richard's question earlier on, which is a very tough and difficult one to answer. He's asking, how are the COP30 presidency roadmap on TAF, transition away from fossil fuels, and national regional roadmaps agreed in Santa Marta and countries' NDCs under the Paris Agreement expected to relate to one another, if at all? Are there any formal, procedural or legal connections foreseen? I think that is, a really difficult one to know how these things are going to unfold. From what we've seen at the moment, there isn't anything really in terms of the formal process to bring these things together. And I think obviously that's going to be a huge topic, and one that we are going to be asking about a lot in our reporting, at the talks, starting from Bonn, because really this is the first opportunity that we're going to have to address this issue after Santa Marta. So I think we all want to know as much as you do. And at Bonn, we'll hopefully ask the COP30 presidency what their ideas might be for that. But as I mentioned before, the COP31 presidency, the Turkish side, has sort of warned against this fragmentation. So it is really, really hard to know, I think, how all of this is going to land. But you would have thought that if there aren't any formal connections foreseen, that it could all be a bit of a mess. Well, I mean, it definitely will be a mess. But so, somebody is going to be thinking hard about how to bring that all together. But, if that is decided within the UN climate process itself, it will, require consensus. And as we know, getting that on anything to do with roadmaps and fossil fuels is pretty difficult at the moment. So I wish we could give you a better answer on that, Richard, right now. But we're waiting with bated breath to find out on that, and hopefully by the end of COP31 we'll have a better idea. I just wanted to bring in a question from the Q&A that we had submitted earlier, and maybe we can close with this. Yeah, we can all pitch in perhaps. After the disappointing outcomes of COP30, is the UN climate process being seen as less important this year? Well, I'll start. From what I've heard, the registrations for Bonn are pretty much in line with previous years. I think it tends to be sort of 6,000-7,000 delegates. Don't have an official figure on that. I've also heard people saying that, given the geopolitical situation, the oil price hikes, and the difficulties that countries are experiencing, that maybe there's more skin in the game for them to be pushing forward on the energy transition within the UN climate process. So I guess we'll have to see. I've also heard people saying that actually, because the logistics in Antalya are, we hope, going to be a lot easier than Belém, which we all know was a total nightmare, and we had to write a lot of virtual column inches on the difficulties of people getting accommodation, getting to Belém, and all the rest of it. Hopefully in Turkey we won't have that distraction, that difficulty, the expense, so that perhaps again we're gonna see like a bounce back after Belém, because I think in the end there were only about maybe 55,000 people attended, and the top attendance that we've had so far was in Dubai, which I think was around 80,000, and that was a pretty easy COP to get to and attend. So maybe people will be rushing to COP31 because it's a bit easier for them to get to. The UN climate process rumbles on, and it's still there. It's the main multilateral game in town, and developing countries, although some, such as India, seem a little bit kind of disengaged at the moment, and China was pretty quiet in Belém. But I imagine they'll be turning up. How about Argentina, Thais? What can we expect from governments?
What we expect from the government? Well, we need to remember that even when they withdraw the delegation at COP29 in Baku, they continue participating after that, and they are still under the Paris Agreement. We wrote an article in Climate News explaining why it is a little more difficult for Milei's government to withdraw from the Paris Agreement than maybe was for Trump with the US. But so far they are going to be in Bonn. We don't know if it's going to be a two-people delegation as last year. And basically, the focus that they have been doing both in the last ERSB and even the COP is on gender, and asking for specifications like for Argentina, gender is only male and female. Not really hearing from them like the really discussions on, for example, finance. That is something that a country like Argentina is in need. I would say it would also interesting to see what happened with Chile, because it's the new government, also a very extreme right government with some skeptical positions on climate science. And I wanted also to add that it will be interesting regarding the question by Richard on the roadmap. It will be interesting the position of Colombia, because there are presidential elections in the coming days, and Colombia is the one countries leading that process. So it will be interesting considering what happened on the election, like how that process continues.
And of course, the US won't be officially there, we expect, due to having exited both the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC. But, you know, most other countries, or all other countries, appear to be hanging in there pretty much. So we're looking forward to heading to Bonn, or at least Joe and Thais will be heading to Bonn shortly. And I think we better wrap up there as we're slightly over time. So just wanted to say thanks very much for joining us today, for the questions. And just one small ask before you go. If you haven't already, please do consider upgrading to a paid subscription, which will get you full access to all our coverage from Bonn, and it directly supports the independent journalism that makes webinars like this possible, and all our reporting on climate policy processes, which we hope provide a very valuable service to the people that work on these topics. And to be honest, as philanthropic funding is becoming harder for us to rely on, reader subscriptions are, you know, giving us a bigger pot to enable us to keep on doing what we love doing. Every subscription really helps. So keep an eye on your inbox. You'll receive an email shortly with details of how to subscribe if you'd like to. But in the meantime, thanks ever so much. And we look forward to bringing you our news from Bonn and London Climate Action Week, and all the way through to COP31. Thanks very much for joining us today, and yeah, see you again. Have a good day. Thanks. Goodbye.